They came out of the mist like a rumor. At first, the tread of hundreds, then thousands, soft boots on wet leaves, the creak of leather, and the low human sounds that travel through a forest as if the trees themselves are listening. For the men of Rome under Publius Quinctilius Varus, the morning had an ordinary cadence. They had fought, in the east, in Parthia, elsewhere, and now they were shepherding imperial order back into the northern provinces. They trusted the man who led them. He was a consul of Rome, installed as governor. He carried Rome's law like armor. But that morning, moving down a narrow, rain-slickened road cut between folded hills and alder swamp, Varus did not know the face of the danger that had been cultivated in his camp for years. A Roman-trained warrior named Arminius, who had once sworn fidelity to Augustus and to Rome, and who now, quietly and irresistibly, would take his friends' hands and point them toward an ambush that would unmake a frontier. Before we begin, if tales of power, ambition, and ancient shadows draw you in, tap the like button and subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive in the darkness. When historians, Tacitus, Velleius Paterculus, Cassius Dio, record the calamity, they do so with the sort of breathless moral bewilderment reserved for disasters that were also portents. 3 legions lost, eagle standards taken, the Roman name bleeding in a land beyond the Rhine. Modern writers, from Peter S. Wells to Adrian Goldsworthy, have tried to unpack how such a thing could happen. Tactical mistakes, overconfidence, the peculiarities of northern terrain, the psychology of command, the brittle politics of Rome's provincial rule. Archaeology at Calpharize, the probable site, has since made the story tactile again. Iron fragments in the peat, a disposed haft here, a coin there, bringing the ancient pages back to something like a place you could stand in and smell. Varus's convoy was not a purely military column. It was a moving province. There were legions in formation, clipped, disciplined, heavy infantry who relied on ordered ground to deploy their maniples and lines. But there were also tax collectors, clerks, camp followers, families, pack animals. Marching in that configuration through a landscape that favored ambush was a gamble. The road itself, mud-churned, sinuous, flanked by dense wood and marsh, narrowed their options. Roman battle doctrine was exquisitely suited to open country, where shields could lock and pila be thrown in disciplined volleys. It was not designed for confusion among trees, where a unit could be attacked piecemeal, where small groups could be picked off from cover, where the ground itself could sabotage the ability to form line. Arminius knew this. He had learned the Roman way of war in the auxiliary ranks, had sat in councils, heard Roman camp law, and even enjoyed the trust of certain senators who called him an ally. For years he had cultivated his position, speaking in the tribal assemblies, courting the respect of several Germanic chieftains. He was at once insider and outsider, able to anticipate Roman procedure and to manipulate their expectations. Tacitus, sympathetic to the Roman viewpoint, calls him a man of singular guile. Modern historians call him a master of asymmetry. For the tribes of the Cherusci and their tenuous confederates, Arminius offered a different posture toward Rome. Not submission, not chaos, but a possible balance wherein the stranger's law did not automatically override native custom. There was a longer story here, of course, of Rome's imperial pulse after Actium, of Augustus's careful expansion and administrative reach, of local leaders pressed into clientage. But Teutoburg's immediate anatomy is a study in misread signs and the lethal patience of a plan matured. In late summer of the year 9 CE, Varus had orders to collect levies, settle grievances, and demonstrate the authority of Rome. He trusted in pace and in precedent. He trusted that discipline would translate into security. He trusted in the person recommended to him as a guide and ally, Arminius. One should slow down and hear the terrain. Imagine early autumn in northern Germany, the air heavy with rain, the soil sodden, sheets of fog clinging to the valleys like cloth over a table. The road that Varus followed snaked through a forested ridge. Later traditions would point to a place the Romans would call Teutoburg, though the exact geography is debated. Archaeology has narrowed the search to the Kulk-Rizi area, where iron slivers, a handful of coins, and the pattern of disturbed earth suggest a violent event. For the marching legion, the road was a line of least resistance, until it was a funnel. The Roman column rolled into the trap in a manner both ordinary and fatal. Scouts reported no immediate threat. The tribes offered no visible host. Arminius had arranged meetings and councils, using his Roman fluency to reassure Varus, to encourage lengthy marches through terrain of choice. Whether Varus was warned and ignored, or whether he trusted too fully, the result is the same. The legions were drawn into ground that robbed them of their formation. The vanguard, the rear, the reserves, all could be isolated. In such a place, the discipline that is Rome's strength becomes a chain that can be pulled taut and broke. Consider the moment when the first arrows in small parties appeared from between trees. Imagine short sentences, the pace of small units under stress. Spears glinted in filtered light. Horses skittered on mud. A messenger ran back, breath steaming, eyes filled not with the stoic calm of a general, but the frantic clarity of someone who has seen something impossible. The road blocked, the woods full of spear points, the glint of axe blades between trunks. Roman commanders tried to form ranks. The legions responded like a machine being stopped in motion. Men turned to face threats that came from every side. The maniples tried to close gaps, scorpiones and javelins were thrown, but the forest ate the order of it. The Germans, using light, mobile tactics and intimate knowledge of their ground, slipped around hedges and along ravines. The fighting stretched and snapped and ran in pieces. Varro's responsibility is the subject of Roman blame. Ancient sources tilt toward explaining his choices as rash. Some modern interpreters suggest he was politically pressurized, that humiliation for Rome in the provinces was not an option, that delay would be seen as weakness. He had other constraints: administration, the need to project strength, perhaps even the practical pressure to move before winter. But whatever the reasons, when the column found itself corked in a ravine between hills and swampy ground, the Romans found their formations broken and their will tested. Arminius had not orchestrated a single moment of mass shock, so much as engineered a cascade. He used the environment to make the Roman strengths into liabilities. Light infantry darted out and drove wedges between cohorts. He selected positions that funneled men into pinch points where signal and control broke down. Cavalry, supplied by Arminius's own allies, attacked the Roman flanks and then withdrew into cover, drawing Romans after them. It is likely, as modern analyses suggest, that the Germanic fighters coordinated to keep pressure on multiple parts of the column, denying the Romans the ability to concentrate force in a decisive counterstroke. There are images one cannot help preferring as one imagines the combat. The discipline of a Roman maniple, shield-locked and advancing, the thunder of legionary feet, the hit and run of Germanic warriors, their short spears and slashing knives, the deep, ancient wood that muffled shouts and turned a single command into a rumor. There are also details that evidence offers without sentiment: the loss of standards. The Aquila, the eagle standard of a legion, was more than metal. It was a repository of honor. When 3 eagles were taken, it was not simply a tactical loss, but a symbolic wound to Rome's civic pride. Ancient writers dwell on that theft because Rome understood symbolic defeat as operating on the same currency as territorial loss. A good historian, Peter Wells for example, reminds us that the political and cultural dimensions of the loss are as important as the military. For Romans, the Rhine had been a flexible frontier, but Teutoburg showed how fragile projection could be when local knowledge and will combined against a foreign military at the right moment. The immediate aftermath was not merely the physical annihilation of legions, it was the exposure of a strategic hub that Rome had not adequately sheltered. Augustus is said, by ancient writers, to have been shaken to the point of deep personal anguish, pacing the palace in despair.
Whether the emperor truly declared, as an anecdote puts it, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions, or whether later sources dramatized his grief, the psychological effect is clear. The Roman world paused. The slaughter itself must be narrated with restraint. Men were cut down. Many died fighting. Many were captured and slaughtered in the dense ground. The damp muck turned metal and flesh into the same dark mass. The air filled with the sound
of struggle, the groan of hacked wood, and the short, animal noises of pain, not to titillate, but to suggest the human cost. We do not need to linger over gore. The essential horror is in the scale and the social consequences. 3 legions, composed not only of fighting men, but of families and the civic ties they embodied, vanished as a military unit. The survivors carried that ruin into years of restless frontier policy. The tribes who had fought were not united by an ideology that could substitute for Roman organization. They could contest and then withdraw into their own polities. The victory at Teutoburg was therefore decisive and limited at once. It stopped Roman hopes for a quick, coercive incorporation of Germania, but it did not hand Arminius the tools to create a lasting, centralized state in Rome's stead. There are small dramas within the larger catastrophe: the fate of individual commanders, the last moments of officers who tried to rally their men, the acts of courage by centurions who stood to buy time for others to escape, the loyalties that broke and reformed in a few hot hours. Velleius Paterculus, writing with the wounded pride of a Roman who had survived campaigns, paints Varus in the worst possible light. Tacitus, later and sardonic about imperial pretensions, records the political tremors in Rome. Cassius Dio adds his own moral seasoning. Modern scholars bring archaeological caution. The site at Calchrise shows many small groups of concentrated finds, suggestive of ambushes and piecemeal slaughter, not a single-pitched battle on a field. Those iron fragments, the occasional coin, the distended pattern of disturbed earth, taken together with ancient testimony, allow us to reconstruct a battle of constricted angles and tactical patience. And yet one cannot tell this without the human angles that make the story live across time. Imagine Arminius in council with his fellow chieftains before the attack, speaking in a language both Roman and native, a man who had learned to adopt Rome's ways and then to weaponize that knowledge. He likely argued for the need to salvage autonomy. He may have invoked family obligations, the inviolability of native custom, the danger of Roman law being writ in timber and then in hearts. These reconstructed speeches are not claims of fact. They are plausible psychological scaffolding that explain motive. What matters is that the Germanic coalition, at least temporarily, trusted Arminius and followed him into a plan of coordinated surprise. A useful modern parallel might be a football team studying the tendencies of a superior opponent and then setting up a counter that is more about denying space than about superior firepower. The Romans, used to open fields and linear combat, found themselves hemmed in by a game that was played in 3 dimensions: the ground, the trees, and the politics that surrounded the line. The result was catastrophic. After the fighting, the consequences rippled outward. Rome retrenched. Augustus, who had gambled on the steady expansion of influence, now shifted to a policy that accepted a fortress line rather than continuous annexation. The Rhine became a hard boundary in Roman consciousness. Military organization adjusted. The empire increased its emphasis on border defense, logistics, and the deployment of mobile forces. It was not immediate institutional genius that saved Rome. There was panic, political finger-pointing, changes in command. But over time, the empire reoriented away from further wholesale conquest of Germania and toward embedding its power in provinces it could better control. The cultural impact was no less important. For Romans, who measured their identity against victory and order, the defeat at Teutoburg was a wound that did not heal quickly.
The loss of standards and the slaughter of legions entered public memory in poems, in monuments, in the way generals were judged afterward. For the Germanic peoples, the victory became a story told at hearths, a cautionary tale for the arrogant, a hopeful tale for those resisting assimilation. But the long-term political result was not a German nation. The tribal world remained fragmented, and in the centuries to come, the Rhine would remain a contested but stable boundary between Romanized provinces and Germania. Archaeology complicates and deepens the narrative. The finds at Kalkriese, mail fragments, a peculiar scatter of metal, and the layering of riverine silt suggest that elements of the Roman column tried to move through low-lying country, were boxed in by rising water, and then ambushed at choke points. Coins show the period and possible circulation of troops. The material record does not confirm every dramatic anecdote. No mass grave with a single identifiable Varus, no intact triple eagle trophy, but it gives texture. It brings the battle down from an abstract catastrophe to a place where a historian can point and say, with reasonable confidence, this is where men struggled in a forested trench, and where Roman equipment and Germanic weapons lay within spitting distance of one another. We must also ask why Teutoburg, as a single battle, carried such an oversized place in history. Part of the answer lies in symbolism. Rome's propaganda demanded triumphs. Defeats were dangerous not only tactically, but culturally. The loss of 3 legions under a governor's watch questioned the empire's invincibility. But beyond symbolism, Teutoburg mattered because it forced Rome to reevaluate the limits of power. The empire could administer provinces, it could project power along roads and through river valleys, but when faced with a decentralized and determined resistance that leveraged intimate knowledge of place, it had fewer easy answers. For students of warfare, Teutoburg is an early modern lesson in the perils of projecting a conventional military system into challenging terrain against an enemy that does not play by the same rhythm. There are later moments in the narrative that deserve their own treatment. Germanicus's campaigns to avenge the loss, the slow return of the standards under Tiberius, and later Augustan efforts to bury the psychological seam of the disaster. But for now, the central lesson is tactical and human. Arrogance and habit can blind the most disciplined force when an opponent combines
local knowledge, patience, and betrayal. It is also a story about trust and intimacy corrupted. Arminius's betrayal was not merely a military ploy. It was the subversion of diplomatic and personal bonds that Rome thought secure. That is a social wound as much as a military one. In a podcast studio, one of us might lean forward and say, "It is tempting to romanticize Arminius as a nascent national hero, and tempting to excoriate Varus as an inept leader. The truth sits somewhere in between. A commander's decisions are shaped by pressures we barely glimpse from the outside." The other might respond, "And the terrain, don't forget the terrain. You can have the best general in the world, but if you lead heavy infantry into a funnel, you've handed your enemy an advantage." These exchanges, brief and human, serve to anchor the listener. History is not only about great men or anonymous masses, but about choices, places, and the texture of lived experience. The night that followed the slaughter, if there was a night in the strict sense for the survivors, must have been a ruinous concatenation of exhausted shepherding and slippery escape. The forest swallowed men. Those who could flee ran with the raw fear of people who had watched the world they knew shatter. Word filtered back to the Rhine, to the ports, to Rome itself, in fits and fragments. Augustus received reports that confirmed his worst fears. The political fallout included reprisals, inquiries, and a reorientation of policy towards stabilizing the frontier rather than ambitious expansion. It is not a hyperbole to say that Teutoburg redefined Roman strategic imagination in the north. The battle's echo persists because it is, in a sense, a parable. It is about hubris and patience, about the vulnerability of ordered formations to the disorder of the local. It is about the charge of identity. Who gets to make law in a place where the land bends differently?
and about how a single, brilliantly executed plan of ambush can alter the course of empires. Yet it is not the last word on Roman strength. Rome learned, adapted, and continued to be the preeminent power in the Mediterranean for centuries. Teutoburg is thus both a disaster and a pivot. What remains, when we stand at Calchrize or when we hold the pages of Tacitus, is a lesson in perspective. To the men who perished, it was an immediate, total catastrophe. To Rome, it was a lesson learned the hard way. To the Germanic tribes, it was a moment of rare unity and success, though one that would not translate neatly into statehood. For us, centuries removed, the story becomes a mirror of how empires can be undone by the same mechanics that made them powerful, and how individuals, Arminius, Varus, the centurions, the nameless common soldiers, move history through choices that, in the end, seem both inevitable and tragically contingent. If you stand in the wet morning where the road once ran, you can still imagine the fog closing in, and
The place carries small artifacts of that day, iron fragments, a cluster of nails, a coin with a likeness worn smooth by time. These objects do not tell us everything. They tell us this: something violent happened here, something that forced Rome to reckon with its limits. For the scale of the loss and the swiftness of the victory, Teutoburg remains one of those rare shocks that remind military students and curious readers alike why terrain, culture, and human agency matter as much as numbers on a page. But the story does not end in the damp of the forest. What follows is Rome's response: a cautious policy of border fortification, intermittent punitive raids led by commanders like Germanicus, and a long-term withdrawal from the dream of provincialization east of the Rhine. Augustus rearranged imperial priorities. The Rhine hardened. The memory of the 3 lost eagles came to symbolize both Roman vulnerability and, paradoxically, its capacity for eventual recovery. As standards were later returned, much of the sting was blunted by ritual and political narrative. The battle's long shadow, however, would linger in Roman culture as a reminder of the empire's need to temper ambition with humility. There is a final human note. Somewhere, perhaps, a soldier who had been young in the ranks that day lived out his life with that morning as the contour that shaped his story. Scarred, yes, but also bearing the knowledge that life can continue after disaster. The Germanic victors celebrated a rare triumph, but their societies remained defiant, decentralized, and not destined to coalesce into the kinds of institutions Rome commanded. History, then, keeps its balance. A brilliant ambush can shatter a field and a myth, but it does not always redraw maps in the long sweep. Later discussions among scholars often return to questions. Could Varus have done otherwise? Was Arminius inevitable as a challenger? Was the Roman strategy fundamentally flawed or merely misapplied in terrain foreign to it? Each answer is partial. The more satisfying view is a composite. Leadership mistakes, political pressures, environmental constraints, and the cunning exploitation of local alliances combined to produce a decisive, shocking outcome. So we end this part of the story with the image that has haunted writers since antiquity. 3 legions, once symbols of order and might, lost in a northern forest whose trees did not keep their secret for long. The ground at Calchrize keeps fragments of their presence, and the written sources keep fragments of their names. Between those fragments we reconstruct, we argue, we feel. Respect for craft, sorrow for the waste of youth and discipline, and a curiosity that asks, what happens next? In Rome, policies changed and campaigns were planned. In the Germanic lands, songs were sung. The world adjusted. What follows is the long answer to the question Teutoburg posed. How does a great power endure when humbled by local resistance? The answer plays out in the campaigns that came after, in the diplomacy and fortification that remade imperial practice, and in the memory culture that turned defeat into a lesson for centuries. But that is a story with its own rhythm and its own set of characters. Germanicus among them, the returning standards, Roman courts and exile lists, and it deserves its own careful telling. We will return to those after we let the forest hold its breath for a moment and listen to the immediate aftermath. The exhausted survivors arranging the dead. The messengers stumbling from the trees with their reports. The first queries arriving in Rome. For now, the road lies mud-slick and empty, and the trees have eaten a day that changed an empire's course. The survivors moved like a tide that had been thinned to its barest trickle. Some limped, some dragged their shields. Some walked with the quiet, flat stare of men who had already rehearsed death and found it lacking. Where the ground had been churned by hooves, it now held the prints of a different passage, the careful footprints of those who came after, to look, to sort, to bury. A few who still wore officers' cloaks, torn, stained, sat on roots and tried to name what remained of their world. Names of centurions, the numbers of companies, whether the eagle's pole had finally been cut down or carried away. Rumors did the work memory could not do. Mouths told small facts that might or might not be true, and with each retelling, a certainty hardened or crumbled. They set about the dead with a grim automatic charity. Where practical, bodies were arranged, faces turned toward the sun where possible. A soldier who had been a medic in a different campaign collected scraps of linen and tried to staunch the worst wounds where it made sense. More often, there was only the slow, methodical work of separating what mattered from what did not. Belts and buckles, swords still in scabbards, signet rings, intact portions of standards. A few men knelt and prayed in the only way they knew, short gestures, muttered names of household gods, a sentence to whatever power might listen. Others cursed the gods and the generals in the same breath. The first messengers were like flints struck from a larger stone, sharp sparks sent in all directions. One sentry who had slipped through at dusk, hair matted, shoulder bruised where a spear had glanced off a piece of armor, ran toward the nearest outpost, his breath tearing like wind through reeds. Another made for the river and flagged a small galley that plied the Rhine, trading its cargo for haste. They carried the same ruin in different languages. Ambush, lost, 3 legions, Varus, dead. Each courier added the detail his terror allowed him to keep. In some taverns, men refused to believe the first reports. In others, the news arrived like a contagion, spreading through the camps and into the towns along the river. News moved faster than it had in years. The Rhine, once an imagined boundary, became a line along which men measured panic and resolve. By the time the reports reached the larger forts, commanders were dispatching riders south, the clack of hooves sending tremors through provincial stations. The provincial governor, rumors later named him in many ways, sat with his aides and shaded his eyes. In Rome, the name Varus landed like a stone thrown into still water. The rings of it widened into every office. Augustus, in his house, received messengers whose faces were hollow with speed and whose hands trembled. They spoke in halting sentences, leaving out what they could not bear to say. There was a public performance to grief in Rome. Voices rose, senators clustered, petitions were drafted. But beneath the ritual was a raw, private grief. Letters flew between the palace and the field like frantic prayers. Augustus reportedly paced, a ruler who had seen the empire stitched and unstitched by victories and defeats, and yet here was a wound that cut at something older than policy. It cut the idea that Roman order was unassailable. He asked a single, terrible question, one that would be remembered as much for its human anguish as for its historical weight. Varus, give me back my legions. Whether he spoke those words aloud, or they were ascribed later by storytellers, the sorrow they spoke of was apt. The emperor's counselors argued in close rooms about retribution and prudence, and for a time the two impulses roiled together without resolution. Back in the damp earth of the ambush, the victors moved through the aftermath with their own mixtures of exhilaration and caution. They were not a single people with a single purpose. They were a coalition whose members might part ways at the next harvest.
Some acted as if the forest had been a place of cleansing, singing short songs over the bodies of enemies, sharing the spoils and offering bold, immediate counsel to their leaders. Others stripped what they could and then retreated to the hills to avoid the inevitable Roman reaction. Arminius, if he was present among them in full command and visible to all, carried himself with the steady intent of a man who had crossed a threshold. He had not created the hatred alone. He had stoked a network of resentments and woven a plan around Roman trusting habit. Whether he now saw the victory as a path to a kingdom or as a single potent statement was a question that would preoccupy chroniclers later. At the moment the victors dispersed, returning to villages and kin, they did so with the uneasy sense that triumph also invited danger. Among the items that survived the chaos were messages and dispatches that revealed how Rome's machinery functioned under stress. One sealed letter, soaked at the edges, was found clutched in a dead messenger's hand. It bore the marks of hurried traveling, a seal half melted by heat. Another found its way to a fort and then slowly to the hands of scribes who began the grim accounting. Numbers
of men, losses by cohorts, lists of missing officers. That inventory became the language of empire's response. Sums, replacements, the calculation of how much it cost to plug a hole in a border that had been imagined as permanent. The loss of standards, those bronze emblems of unit identity, was more than a symbolic stain. In Roman eyes, an eagle lost signified a rupture in the chain that bound legionaries to state, to honor, to a memory they had been taught to worship. Commanders in Rome spoke of recovering the standards with the language of justice and vengeance. But recovery required more than desire. It required men, ships, supplies, and careful minds. The Senate argued privately over the cost of honor. Some demanded immediate retaliation, others counseled wait, fortify, and understand the enemy before committing the massed legions once again to the treacherous northern woods. In the week after the ambush, Roman intelligence, such as it was, mustered itself. Scouts were sent along known riverways. Diplomatic envoys tried to parley where possible with tribes not yet united in hostility. Rome could not credibly threaten to obliterate every Germanic group. The logistics were staggering, but it could and would attempt surgical answers, punitive expeditions, targeted displays of force, and the slow engineering of alliances with rival chieftains. Augustus, always pragmatic where possible, sanctioned measures that would both soothe the face of Roman power and alter the terms of frontier control. Fortification lines were reinforced, supply depots were better organized, a new emphasis on river patrols and small, fast reaction forces took shape. But while policy hardened and the capital swallowed its disbelief, the personal costs of the mourning in the forest accumulated in ways statistics could not record. Letters arrived at households in various provinces, sealed with wax and folded in haste. A mother in a municipium learned her son's cohort would not come home. A wife read without speaking the name of her husband in a list of missing. She laid the paper on the table and stared at the blank hearth. Men who had survived tried to go on the next day to tasks that had become small and strange. Mending a sleeve, carving a crude grave marker, sharpening a spear where the handle had rotted. Some claims to have seen ghosts in the fog, friends who died in the churn of trees walking for a moment at dusk and then gone. Others threw themselves into practicalities, identifying the dead, counting spoil, bargaining for transport. In Rome, the loss became a subject of public spectacle and private obsession. Playwrights later used it as a canvas for tragedy. Senators used it as argument for or against further expansion, and soldiers used it to test their own courage against the myth that the legions were invincible. The story of the 3 lost eagles matured into a lesson both political and moral, that there were limits to imperial reach, that local knowledge often trumped superior training, that a people fighting on its own ground could, under certain conditions, unmake the march of an empire. Yet this was not a single, simple moral. For many Romans, it was also the reason to renew effort. If the empire could be wounded, then it could be healed. And healing required work and planning that went beyond fury. Augustus's later decisions to shore up the Rhine, to recalibrate how Rome governed its frontier peoples, to invest in a defensive depth, came from this impulse to make durable what had been briefly shredded. But in the forest, the immediate business was not the making of policy, it was the making of order from ruin. Men made lists. Priests pronounced prayers for the dead. Standard-bearers measured the space left by the missing emblems and noted where the bands of silk had been cut. Archaeology would, centuries later, turn up rusted fragments of metal, the clasp of a belt, a child's toy near a ditch, things that confirmed and complicated the narrative. Those items would point to small human economies of grief and survival. The hurried burial of a fallen centurion beside a clump of roots, the careful placement of a coin in a dead man's hand, perhaps an attempt by a family to preserve some trace of who had been. At the time, most immediate and pressing were messengers and the road. The road offered a way out and a way in, and for a while it served both functions. It carried survivors away from the forest and carried the news of loss and the will to respond back toward the imperial center. As Rome absorbed the shock, commanders took stock in ways that were practical and political. Reinforcements were mustered not merely to avenge but to prevent the spread of unrest. Diplomatic overtures were made to tribes whose neutrality could be purchased. And yet, the ambush had already altered the psychology of empire. It taught the Romans, through a cost they could not ignore, that victory in a foreign wood required more than discipline. It required adaptation to landscape, to the capacities and customs of opponents, and to the precariousness of alliances stitched together by patronage and miscomprehension. When the smoke of immediate action cleared, those who remained in the region, farmers, woodsmen, tribal leaders, began to calculate their own futures. Some saw in the victory a promise of greater autonomy. Others feared Roman reprisals that would bring devastation in seasons to come. A few families buried small hoards to hide from soldiers. Others packed children and goods and chose to leave their farms near the border for safer ground. The forest that had been the scene of slaughter resumed in its own time something like a normal rhythm. Moss grew over scorched leaves. New undergrowth claimed abandoned tracks, and the sound of small animals returned. But for human beings, the morning's traces remained like scars that healed before the eye but throbbed beneath the skin. This was only the beginning of the long conversation between Rome and the lands east of the Rhine. The immediate aftermath demanded lists and marches, letters and funerals, knee-jerk rhetoric in the Senate and private strategies in the palace. But the deeper question, how the empire would live with the knowledge of vulnerability, would be answered in campaigns and in council, in the return of standards and in the songs that bards sang at hearths. For the men who stood among the dead, for those who limped back to the river, the future was an ache, a question they could not lay to rest. What would be made of their grief, and who would hold the cost? Night came, bringing a cold that found the seams in cloaks and the places where wounds had not been closed. Fires were lit in small circles, candles guttered where hands trembled. A few survivors huddled together and spoke in low voices of the men they had lost, repeating names as if by saying them again they could summon what the forest had taken. Others, too exhausted to speak, simply lay back and allowed the darkness to press against the memory. And in the capital, while debates and plans took shape, the first moves toward response were being made. Dispatches authorized, orders inked, the slow turning of an imperial machine that could build as surely as it could burn. Yet none of those motions could, in that first fragile night, replace the simple human work of counting heads, of binding wounds, of deciding which faces would be carved into memory and which would be folded into anonymous sorrow. The forest had eaten a day of Rome's self-conception. The empire would spend years deciding what that meal meant and how to answer. Dawn would bring riders again, and with riders would come new facts, new names, new lists. Men who had thought themselves invisible now found themselves cast into histories. The world would tilt in ways both immediate and gradual, and the response would be as practical as it was rhetorical.
For the moment, however, the night kept its quiet, and the survivors listened to the far and near sounds of a world that always continued, stubbornly after catastrophe. Dawn came cold and clear, slicing the mist from the ruts like a blade. Riders broke from the trees in small, breath-steaming groups, faces set, reins creaking. They carried tallies and names, faces folded into cloth, the last scraps of what the forest had spared. Where the survivors had made their circles of fire, there was movement now, men rising with a deliberateness that belonged to the living, binding splints, washing blood from hair, setting what could be set in order. The work of mourning was simple and precise: count, mark, fold, lay out. A few knives were sharpened and used to smooth the edges of linen before the bodies were wrapped. A woman who had watched the night through took a coin from a dead hand and slipped it into her bosom. She smiled as if she had recovered a talisman and set off toward the lane that led to the river. The riders
went from camp to camp, reading their lists aloud so that no name would be missed. Voices rose, some steady, some breaking, yet all moved with the same function: to make each man who had been taken into a name in the record of the living. Near the road, a small knot of family clustered around a simple grave already dug. A boy handed a handful of earth as if discharging a debt. An old woodsman who had not spoken all night called the names of his comrades, and the sound of them, rough, startled vowels, hung in the air like a conjuration against oblivion. Beyond the immediate camps, the riders rode on, carrying their papers toward the nearest fort. There, a veteran officer, bent with many winters, waited beneath the carved lintel where the eagle's shadow fell. He looked at the lists and at the faces of the men who brought them, and his jaw worked. The numbers were more than he had feared. He sent runners to the palisades and to neighboring hamlets. He ordered that the dead be counted twice, and that the living be counted firmly. He sent a man with sandaled feet toward the river to find a priest willing to attend the rites. Out on the road, he watched as peasant wagons emptied their cargoes of tools and animals set by the wayside, some of them abandoned where families had fled in the night. The governor in the provincial house received the first formal dispatch that afternoon, brought by a rider who had ridden hard enough to have the dust of the forest still clinging to his cloak. He read it twice, his expression unreadable, the paper in his hand like a map of loss. He appointed couriers to the capital with tidings that would rattle the heart of the city. He ordered scouts to move among the neighboring tribes, bearing gifts and firm words, shoring up loyalties with both wine and the hint of force. He called together a small council, centurions, a tribune perhaps, local notables, and asked for a clear accounting of men and material. Their talk was brisk, a net of calculations: where to send the standards, how many veterans from the inland cohorts could be spared, whether to burn or repair the farmhouses left hollow. Between proposals, there were softened remarks about grief and the privacy of mourning. Those words kept the council from hardening into nothing but measures. The men who would march came as needed. A company was named, a half-squadron of cavalry, a handful of auxilia recruited from the border tribes that had not raised arms. Flags were cleaned, banners tightened to their poles, the leather of shields oiled until it shone like some dark mirror. A trumpet sounded, and lads who had not yet learned the weight of a shield flinched, but older men steadied them with hands that had carried spears across many fields. Orders were given that were as much to steady the soul as to prepare for action. The men would march at a steady pace, supplies would be catalogued, scouts would sweep the flanks. The commander's voice carried not only command, but a certain plea for certainty, for traction in a world that had tilted. Among the local people, other decisions were being made in quieter rooms. In a longhouse near the river, a family wrapped a small satchel of coins and buried it beneath a flagstone. A mother folded her child's tunic into a parcel and set it beside the hearth. She kissed the wool and then, when no one watched, pressed the cloth to her face as if to draw strength from the child's shape. A chieftain who had not yet declared himself to Rome met with envoys at the edge of his fields. He sat on a low stool and listened to offers of alliance. Grain in return for neutrality, protection in return for scouts. He asked little and spoke less. He had watched the ground for 7 seasons and knew how quickly allegiance could turn with the favor of the harvest. In the villages, a bard who had watched the battlefield from a ridge worked with a reed and a tightened string to run the lines of what he had seen under his tongue. His verses were not yet a fuller song. They were fragments, images arranged like bones before a flesh was laid over them. A wave of shields breaking among the trees. A standard bending under the rain of arrows. A small child's hand reaching for a soldier who could not return its touch. He sang them low to himself and to those who would listen, and when the tune found shape, it was taken from mouth to mouth, altered by grief and rumor until it belonged to the country rather than to any one singer. News that the empire would respond traveled by a different speed. In the capital, where officials wove the fate of provinces between clambering egos and the emperor's temper, the dispatches arrived in packets. They moved through hands that made their own calculations. Ministers who counted the grain ships, secretaries who tallied the veterans' rosters, couriers who smelled of distant dust. The Senate would speak with rhetorical flourish. Yet for those wrapped in the immediate circle of the loss, words from Rome felt remote as painted herons in a child's toy box. What they needed was presence, the touch of a standard, the sanction of law, the security of an order given in a voice that could be heard across a plain. As preparations were made, small and intimate acts continued. A man who had been lucky enough to survive tended the wounds of another who had bled most of the night. 2 brothers, both pale and shaking, took turns holding a bowl of thin soup and feeding an old soldier until he could swallow. A child, too young to understand the fixity of absence, was taught how to say the names of the fallen in a steady cadence,
so that the names would not be scattered into forgetting. Such practices were religion enough for some, and for others they were the only ceremony permitted by fatigue. The forest beyond the camps recovered in ways that had nothing to do with the men. Leaves released the memory of flame as they drank the dew. A fox padded along a path once crowded with arms. Birds took up a chorus that had been silent when steel sang through branches. Yet, even as nature resumed the usual music, the human landscape rearranged itself. New courtyards were made for the burial. New committees emerged, men and women who, by the necessity of the day, organized supplies for those who had fled. A small congregation gathered in an abandoned inn to pray and to count who among them would leave and who would stay. The first funerals were private and spare. The bodies were wrapped in cloth and laid on low carts. A few stones marked shallow graves along the river. Men who had known one another by the tilt of breath and by shared bread acted with a holiness reconfigured by loss. They washed the dead, they washed each other's hands, they sang low, allowing a public tenderness to pass into what would later be called memory. There were no marble tablets yet, only small stakes and names whispered into the wind. When the first detachments finally turned their faces out of the province, they did so not as thunder, but as something heavier. Columns moving with the ache of necessity, standards held high but with less swagger than before. They left behind the women and the children, the few old men, and those too young to leave, and the forests reclaimed their edges where the marchers' boots had broken the moss. The road swallowed the dust of their passage, and for a time seemed a gray promise, carrying away more than men. It bore with it questions and decisions, the seed for further action and for the policies that would come to define the borders. At a wayside, a commander halted his troop and set a small wreath upon a cairn where a name had been inscribed the night before. He touched the wreath with fingers calloused by years of spear and plow, and then he looked into the trees as if seeking the answer from the wood itself. The forest gave him nothing but the sound of a stream and the distant cry of a hawk. He understood, as did the rest, that the empire's answer would be made of routs and forts and treaties. Yet beneath those instruments lay the harder work of mourning, of recalculating who could be trusted, of shaping the stories that would carry this day into the seasons to come. The road now would carry letters to the capital and men toward new orders. It would also carry simple human cargo, the small bundles of grief, the cloth with which a father had wrapped his son's helmet,
The coin pressed into a mother's palm as a last poverty of consolation. These things, folded into the march, would be the long-lasting measures of the day, the private economies of loss that imperial ledgers could not name. As the sun climbed, the survivor circles dispersed into the business of living. A man repaired a wheel. A woman mended a cloak. A boy learned how to lead a mule along the roadside. Yet the day had been eaten by events that would not be contained to one dawn. Under the ordinary motions, the question remained, what would Rome make of this wound? The answer, when it came, would be a mixture of hard and soft, columns and councils, tribute and pardon, a new routing of roads, and perhaps, if prudence held, a reordering of how trust was purchased on the frontier. For now, the road held both the departing and the returning. Riders sped outward with orders and inward with names. The forest kept its silence, and the people kept their small acts of remembrance. The empire would do what empires do, immerse the event in policy and in spectacle, but for those who had lived the night and who would live the days after it, the reckoning would be closer, quieter, and more intimate than any dispatch could render. They would keep the names. They would mend the wounds. They would teach their children how to walk the ruts and how to speak without starting at the sound of leaves. And in the thinned light of the evening, as columns of smoke curled from distant fires and the road shimmered with the tired light of marching men, a new song began to be hummed again, this time with a steadier pace, one that held both anger and a strange, stubborn resolution. It would be sung at hearths and on the road, later at the barracks, and perhaps, in time, in the marble halls of Rome. For the moment, the song was a comfort, a way to contain the memory and to shape it, to make of the day's loss not only a wound, but a story that might teach the empire to move differently among the trees.